I just went out and watched the new Led Zeppelin documentary, Becoming Led Zeppelin, and I wanted to talk about it because there were some things I didn't know and a few things I found really interesting. The movie was directed by Bernard McMahon and produced by Allison McGurdy, who together created the American Epic documentary series, which is about the first recordings of roots music in the United States and is considered one of the best music documentaries ever made. Now, I was never like a massive Led Zeppelin fan. I've always loved them. I was more of a Who guy. I was always like looking into all their background and all that. But I think with Led Zeppelin, maybe the reason was that there wasn't actually that much of, a lot of background information. This actually is the first biographical documentary that Led Zeppelin officially endorsed and were involved in. So a lot of the stuff in this movie is unseen footage, things that they've never talked about before. And one of the best things is there's audio of John Bonham, who died in 1980, talking about the band and their experiences, which is just absolutely amazing. Now, the movie is not about any of the drama or the sensationalist headlines and drugs and all that kind of stuff. It focuses on the music and how the band formed, which is something I've always been interested in, It's like, how did it all happen? What's the story behind it? How did they go from being a band that had their first rehearsal to about 2 years later being the biggest band in the world? And one of my favorite things about it is that it was not only well done, but it still had this vibe of being like a midnight movie like we used to go see in the 70s and 80s, which was the only place we could see any concert footage or documentaries or anything like that. And it starts with them talking about how they grew up and their relationships with their parents. And also, which is really cool, that initial moment, each one of them got drawn into music. And of course, they talk about how America was their dream, how they were so influenced by the music coming out of Memphis, which is known as the home of the blues and the birthplace of rock and roll. And it's just so awesome. There's a part where John Paul Jones is talking about how listening to those records, you could just really hear the bass and how it was so bold and out there in front. And that was a huge influence on him. And John Bonham talking about listening to James Brown records and how the drums were just really out front and such a big part of the sound. And that was huge for him. There's also a lot of stuff about how Jimmy Page and John Paul Jones were studio musicians, which I knew, but I don't want to give too much away, but there's extra stuff in there. I will say, I don't even know if I want to say it, but there's a lot of cool detail in there, and hearing it from their own voices, talking about them as professionals and getting into music, just incredible. Okay, I got to say one thing. Jimmy Page was actually working on Muzak records. And if you know what Muzak was, it was basically elevator music. He was working on those kind of sessions, and it was during one of those one day where he just realized, like, what am I doing here? I need to form a band. And that's what they did. Hearing them talk about how they all met through this music scene in England and John Bonham coming up to Robert Plant and saying, you need a better drummer, and getting together for their first rehearsal, hearing them talk about that, I don't want to give away too many details, but it's just interesting to hear it in their own words, like their impressions of each other. But I will say the consensus was that when they started playing A Train Kept a Rollin', was that the room exploded. They then, after that, got together and rehearsed in a house for weeks, getting ready to record and go on tour. They started writing songs for the first album, but they also practiced other songs for this tour that they had coming up. It was interesting to me as a producer and having been in bands, because most bands, the formation and building up to go on tour, it's this thing that's very gradual, getting people together, and then you have rehearsals and it slowly builds and all that. These guys jumped into this thing completely 100% right off the bat. I think that they knew that they were going to be great. I think they knew that they were onto something incredibly special. They go on to talk about recording the first album, which they did about a month after they got together, which is absolutely mind-blowing. And they did it at Olympic Studios in London on a Helios mixer. And for those of you who know anything about recording studio stuff, I've never actually worked on a Helios mixer, but I have used some of their vintage original mic preamps and EQs, which actually kind of makes a lot of sense now that I think about it. But here's the thing I didn't know, and that is that Jimmy Page produced the albums. This whole thing was his vision. He actually knew what this band should sound like before he even formed the band. I was always under the impression that it was either Eddie Kramer or Glenn Johns that produced the records. They're engineers, and they did help on some of the production, but it's primarily Jimmy Page, which it's very interesting. He talks about how he didn't really want to focus on singles. He wanted to make albums. He wanted to make albums that people listened to all the way through. And you got to realize at that point in time, the music business was mostly about singles. Like it is today, album-oriented rock had not really completely blown up yet. And it's just one of those things where I feel like he was way ahead of his time. The other thing that was interesting was, and I read this online, they don't actually say the exact hours, but how long it took them to make the record. It was 36 hours, including mixing total, to record their first album. And the reason that they can say that so specifically is that Jimmy Page and their manager, Peter Grant, funded the making of the album, which is interesting on a whole other level. You see, most bands and artists don't fund their own records, but Jimmy Page, having worked on huge recording projects, he knew how this worked. He knew that you needed to own your own masters, which meant that when they took their finished mixes around to record labels, they ended up signing with Atlantic Records, they were able to make demands such as no editing of singles. You take the album as is. We're not going to remix it. Like, we call the shots, which is incredibly unusual even by today's standard, but was very unusual back then. From there, they go on to talk about their tour, which is where, it's just so great. There's so much footage. It's kind of some nerdy stuff, looking at like the gear, like what kind of amps are they using. And Jimmy Page, it would appear, only has two pedals, like a distortion box and a wah-wah pedal. Maybe there's a tape delay in there somewhere. I didn't actually hear it on some of those recordings. And some of their earlier shows, like the audience reactions, you see people in the audience or like, huh? They didn't know what they were seeing. They didn't know that they were like witnessing history. But some of my favorite stuff in the movie was that, and also that they play long sections of. I didn't expect them to play so many long sections of the live footage. Just absolutely incredible. You know, watching the live footage of these performances and also the other artists that they show, what really got me was the pure, unbridled authenticity and power and raw emotion of these performances. There's no lip syncing. There's no backing tracks. And even when some of the sound is kind of distorted because Robert Plant is just belting into the mic and it's distorting, or the whole band sounds distorted, that stuff still shines through. It doesn't matter. The other thing I thought was really interesting was really appreciating John Paul Jones more. I never really thought about his bass playing that much because it was kind of simple. It was just there. You know, I'm focused on the singing and the drums and, Jimmy Page and their virtuoso playing. But John Paul Jones talks about how much he admired John Bonham and kind of wanted to stay out of his way. So that's why he was doing those kind of bass parts. But listening to it again was like, wow, he's actually really the foundation of the band. He was like the glue that held it all together. This big, huge, thundering bass part that it was simple, but it was well executed, and he knew what he was doing. It wasn't simple in a stupid way. It was simple in a very smart way. It's just massive. And the other thing that got me about watching some of the live performances, because they're playing songs, we're used to hearing them a certain way, but they're improvising live. They're switching up parts, which is actually very unusual for rock bands these days. You know, I'm sitting here looking at my notes, and there's all these other things I want to talk about, but this would end up being an hour-long video, and I don't want to give too much away, but I kind of want to focus on things that are interesting to me as a record producer and also somebody who's been in bands and toured. I think the thing that gets me is their decisions and how they really knew what they were doing. For instance, they started on their second album while they were still touring. They were recording in various studios across the UK and the United States. The reason I find this very interesting is because most artists, when they have a hit song, they go out and they tour and things are blowing up. I feel like they go too long trying to push that thing, so they're kind of burnt out by the end of that whole run there. They're just like, and they got to take a big break and kind of reset and go back and do an album. They didn't do that. I think they toured for, they said 7 months or something like that. But they basically just kind of kept the whole thing going. So they just moved right in to making the second album while they're still pushing the first one. And that meant that they could keep the energy up. There was a quote. It was Robert Plant talks about keeping up the road energy, the spontaneity, and the urgency, which is just absolutely amazing and very, very smart. Because most artists have the sophomore slump, which happens because there's time to think about it and second guess yourself. The other thing, since they're in so much control, they were psychologically in a different place to go in and make the record and not run into that. And when you're kind of like in a rush and you're trying to scramble, and do all that, you don't have time. You're just doing it. You don't have time to freak out about it. The other thing that's interesting is that you got to realize that recording studios back then weren't standardized. Like studios, you couldn't just go out and buy a mixer. A lot of studios had to build their own mixer. Things were not, you walk into a modern studio today and there's just, even the patch bays are usually laid out the same. Back then, they don't really talk about it in the movie. I had to look this up, but they've got some nightmare stories about various studios. They recorded that second album on 8 tracks, which is also kind of mind-blowing, especially when you hear what they talk about. I'm not going to tell you the details, but they talk about choices and things they wanted to do sonically. And it's like, I could see how they would have done it on 8 tracks, but still it's kind of like, wow. But the most important thing is that they recorded what they liked. They wanted to make an album like nobody had ever heard before, which is literally the exact opposite of what most people do when they're working on their second album. But it's precisely the kind of mindset you need to have if you want to make massively successful, culturally relevant records. Now, they don't really talk about this in the film directly, but this band has been accused of cultural appropriation, which is not something I don't want to get too deep into right now because it's a whole video and it's a legitimate subject, but these guys never hide from where they got their influences from and what they loved. And I think they just wanted to be black musicians and all that. They were just taking what they loved and merging it with what they knew how to do. And I feel like the way that musical influences have surged back and forth between the UK and the United States has been so important to how rock music has evolved, and I think that's a great thing. I would also like to shout out the filmmakers and especially the editors on this thing. Having done a lot of editing over the last couple years, I can tell you these guys worked their butts off and did a great job. Just great job, guys. My favorite parts were seeing how hard they worked and how fast and how relentless they were. They were like on a lifetime mission. They were wholly committed to this thing and they were ahead of their time. Also, the thing that really struck me watching them talk was how grateful they were for the experience and the journey. Now, you might think, oh, well, of course, they're rich and famous and all that. But I got to tell you, I've worked with some musical artists that were worldwide famous and very successful who, after all these years, are just bitter and complain about stuff and just don't seem happy about the whole thing. But not these guys. It's an absolute joy to watch them talk about the whole thing. And watching them listen to John Bonham's voice talking about the band all these years later, chokes you up. And then finally, a quote from Robert Plant where he says, "What do you know if you never seek?" That got to me. So there's a lot of stuff in this film that was very emotional. I'd just like to say this is not just a trip down memory lane. It's a reminder of what made rock and roll so powerful and innovative and how these bands were independent and rebels of a system. And finally, this movie is kind of like made me hear the band with fresh ears. It's like I've never heard the music before. So I think I'm going to go and listen to some right now. Thanks for watching the video. I would love to hear any observations or comments, or if you saw the movie and you want to share something, please leave that below. Remember to subscribe. Have a good day, and always be unique.